Shabbat Shalom. This coming Shabbat we read Parashat Vayikra, beginning Sefer Vayikra, the third book of the Torah, and the Ramban introduces his commentary on Sefer Vayikra with a short essay in which he describes the connection between Vayikra and the preceding book, or particularly the latter portions of the preceding book, Sefer Shemot. The Ramban has a very strong opinion that the order of the parshiot, the order of the verses in the Torah, is very important and meaningful, and not at all haphazard or arbitrary. He criticizes strongly Parshim of the Torah, who took the Talmudic phrase, or the rabbinic phrase, Ein mukdamu muchar b'Torah, that things in the Torah don't really have an order of what should become first or what should come afterwards. And so he goes on and says that the connection is that the latter part of Sefer Shemot, after the Jews have already left Egypt, deals for the most part with the event at Sinai, the Great Revelation, and the building of the Mishkan, the building of the Tabernacle. And so it's perfectly logical that Sefer Vayikra would pick up where Sefer Shemot ended off and describe the laws concerning the sacrifices that were offered in the Tabernacle and then later on in the Temple. And he goes on to describe some interesting parallels between Sinai and the Mishkan. It was fenced off from the general public. Not anyone could enter. Those who could enter had to go through purification rituals, and only in certain times, and so on. And so, in a way, the Mishkan, the Tabernacle, was a replacement, a continuation of Sinai, not on the same proportions of the dramatic theophany, the dramatic divine revelation, but just as the Shekhina had its sort of resting place, or had dwelled for a few days on Sinai, it would now dwell in the Mishkan and then later on in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash. Now, an interesting feature is the overlap. That is to say, even before the event at Sinai took place, if we follow the order of the parshiot, the Jews received the command to build the Mishkan. And so there was this sort of preparation even before the event at Sinai, the revelation at Sinai took place, for the Mishkan, which in some sense would be some lower level replication of Sinai. In other words, God revealed himself in a dramatic fashion before 600,000 people at Sinai. And then, in somewhat less dramatic fashion, the Shekhina was in the Mishkan, which went with the Jews through the rest of their wanderings and for their first years of occupation of the Holy Land, and then later on in the temple. But there was this overlap, this period in which the event at Sinai was taking place, and there were already preparations for building the Mishkan. Now, when we move on to the next phase, when the destruction of the temple was hundreds of years afterwards, and the replacement of the Beit HaMikdash by the Mikdash Ma'at, the small sanctuary, the small temple, the many small sanctuaries of the synagogues and Batei Midrash and study halls, we similarly see this overlap that before, just in the generations or two before the destruction of the temple, do we have our first evidence of synagogues and Torah academies. We have no evidence of these things existing during the first temple, but we have them towards the end of the second temple, and this is why we had this famous statement of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, when the Romans were about to destroy the Second Temple, that he said, Tein mi yavne v'chachamea, my request is that you spare the academy at Yavne. And so we had this overlap where the academies were already developing and were ready to take on the next phase of Jewish history, where the Hashrat Shekhina would continue, again, at an even lower level than at Sinai or at the temple, in the many, many synagogues and study halls spread through the Jewish communities in Israel and in the diaspora. So again, we had a sort of overlap, something to sort of ease the transition that the institutions had begun to develop and were ready to take the mantle in the next phase. Now, for those of you who have seen some of my, or at least one of my recent videos, you know that I've been reading now about Freud and his connection to Judaism, especially as it came to the fore in his last book, Moses and Monotheism. And I've been reading recently the book of Professor Yerushalmi, with whom I had the privilege of studying at Harvard a generation ago. And there are some very interesting things that Freud has to say about this period of the destruction of the temple. Freud, for all of his quirks, and I'm not going into his psychoanalysis of religion, but he was looking for the secret of the maintenance of the Jewish people, the survival of the Jewish people, how this small group, this small nation, had carried on the same tradition, the same values, the same teachings for hundreds and thousands of years under the most difficult circumstances and in many different countries. And in the context of looking into this, he was reading historians, and he doesn't mention who they are. I don't know who these historians are, who say some very interesting things precisely about the period of destruction of the temple, and the remark that I made about this overlap, this transition of the Jewish religion from a faith centered around a temple and animal sacrifices to one centered around study and an intellectual discourse, a transition which had already begun while the temple was still standing, and therefore it made the survival of the Jewish people possible after the destruction of the temple. In one of the letters that he sent to his wife, he mentions that, and I'm quoting here from the translation of Professor Yerushalmi, the historians say that if Jerusalem had not been destroyed, we Jews would have perished like so many races before and after us. According to them, the invisible edifice of Judaism became possible only after the collapse of the visible temple. In other words, so many nations that existed side by side with Israel with their own temples were wiped out, never survived the Roman conquest, the other conquests, once their visible temples had been destroyed. But because Jews had already begun to replace the physical temple and the animal sacrifices with intellectual and moral, spiritual values, were able to survive. In another note, a message that he sent to Jerusalem in 1925 upon the occasion of the opening of Hebrew University. He wasn't present, but he sent a congratulatory message. And there he said, and I quote again, historians have told us that our small nation withstood the destruction of its independence as a state only because it began to transfer in its estimation of values the highest rank to its spiritual possessions, to its religion, and its literature. So we've seen several phases in the development of the Jewish people and the inculcation of the spiritual message of the Jews in the way in which the Shekhina dwelled among us, and in the way the dwelling of the Shekhina diffused throughout the Jewish people, from the great dramatic revelation at Har Sinai, which lasted just a few days, through the dwelling of the Shekhina in the Mishkan and in the Beit HaMikdash for several centuries, through a further diffusion in hundreds and thousands of synagogues and Batei Midrash around the world, and the final phase, the ultimate culmination, is the diffusion of this knowledge, this quest for God and this worship of God by studying and getting to know God as best we can, being something that encompasses and inundates all of humanity, which is exactly the messianic end that the Rambam describes at the very final halacha, the very final paragraph of his great code Mishnah Torah, where he says that at the time of the Mashiach, v'lo ya'esek kol ha'olam ela ledat et Hashem bilvad. The only thing people in the entire world will be doing will be questing for God. Ulefikach Yisrael chachamim gedolim v'yodim dvarim hastomim v'amukim v'yasivu dat boram kefi koach adam. The Israel will be great scholars who will understand, finally fathom the great secrets as far as the human mind can conceive of them. And then he ends with a verse from Yeshayahu, the verse from Isaiah, chapter 11, which is his hallmark verse for the Messianic period. Ki malah ha'aretz de'at Hashem, kamayim layam nechasim. Because the world is full of knowledge of God, the way the sea covers the seabed, the way the waters cover the sea. So we have here a progression from a short-lived, highly dramatic event at Sinai to a magnificent tabernacle and temple, to a further diffusion through study halls and synagogues around the world, and finally the messianic culmination, Meher B'Yameinu, of knowledge of God, quest for God, seeking God's God in any as much as far as humans are capable throughout the entire world. Shabbat Shalom. B'Chag Sameach.